I knew something was wrong before either of us said a single word. It was a Sunday in late October, the kind of gray Hampshire morning where the mist still clings to the water meadows long after the bells of Winchester Cathedral have finished ringing, and I had come, as I always did, to collect my daughter-in-law Eleanor after Mass. For 11 years I had watched her walk down those worn stone steps with the same unhurried grace, her coat buttoned just so, her handbag held in the crook of her arm, and always, always, a small smile waiting for me before she even reached the car. That morning, there was no smile. There was only the handkerchief, pressed so tightly between her two hands that her knuckles had gone the color of the limestone behind her. If you are watching this video right now, I would love to know where in the world you are joining me from. Tell me your city, your country, whatever corner of the earth you happen to be sitting in while an old woman tells you her story. And if you believe, as I do, that the smallest objects sometimes carry the heaviest truths, give this video a like before we go any further, because I promise you, this one is going to stay with you. My name is Agnes Fairchild. I am 79 years old, and for the better part of my working life, I was a conservator of historical manuscripts, first at the Hampshire Record Office, and later, in my final years before retirement, assisting the Cathedral Library with the restoration of documents so fragile that a careless breath could turn 300 years of ink into dust. I tell you this not to impress you, because there is very little impressive about spending 4 decades hunched over a magnifying lamp with tweezers in your hand, but because it matters to what happened next. I have spent my whole life learning how to look closely at things that other people walk straight past. I learned to see the difference between an original stitch and a later one, between paper that has aged naturally and paper that has been aged on purpose, between a signature that is genuine and one that only wishes to be. That kind of looking becomes a habit you cannot switch off, even on a Sunday, even in your own daughter-in-law's trembling hands. I have lived on St. Cross Road for 43 years, in a narrow brick house with a green door and a garden that backs onto the water meadows, close enough that on a still evening you can hear the bells of the old hospital chapel, and, if the wind is kind, the distant murmur of the River Itchen sliding past the watercress beds. My husband Charles and I bought that house the year our son Edmund was born, and it has held every joy and every sorrow our family has known since. The walls are lined with photographs going back 5 generations. The dresser in the dining room still holds my mother's good china, chipped in 2 places from a Christmas dinner in 1974 that I will not bore you with today. And in an oak keepsake box on my bedroom windowsill, wrapped in a square of soft tissue paper, there used to live a piece of lace that I loved more than almost any other object I owned. It is strange, the things we decide to treasure. That handkerchief was nothing grand. It was a small rectangle of fine linen, perhaps 8 inches across, edged with handmade bobbin lace, and embroidered in one corner with a spray of honeysuckle. The flowers worked in pale yellow silk thread, so old it had softened to the color of weak tea. My mother, Constance, made it during the last winter of her life, sitting by the fire in the front room of the cottage where I grew up, her fingers swollen with arthritis, but somehow still steady enough to draw a needle through linen with the patience of a woman who had been embroidering since she was 7 years old. She told me once that good needlework was like prayer. You cannot rush it, you cannot fake it, and at the end of it, whether anyone else ever notices or not, you know exactly how much care went into every single stitch. When my son Edmund married Eleanor Whitby in the summer of 2013, I gave her that handkerchief as a wedding gift. I remember the exact words I used because I have repeated them to myself many times since. I told her that this small piece of cloth had survived 2 wars, 1 house fire, and more grief than any of us could properly count, and that I was trusting her to be its next keeper. Eleanor is an antique book restorer by profession, 51 years old, quiet in the particular way that careful people often are, the kind of woman who reads the inside cover of a book before she ever opens the first page. She took that handkerchief from me with both hands, the way you might accept something alive, and she told me she understood exactly what I was giving her. I believed her then. I still believe her now. but for 11 years, that handkerchief sat in a drawer in her own home, taken out only for christenings, funerals, and the occasional Sunday Mass when she wanted, she said, a small piece of the family with her. So you can imagine my confusion that gray October morning. Watching her come down the cathedral steps, holding it the way a person holds something they are afraid to put down and equally afraid to keep. I want to pause here for just a moment because I think there is something worth saying before I go any further into this story. So many of us walk past the objects that matter most in our own homes without ever truly looking at them. We dust them. We move them from one shelf to another. We hand them down at weddings and funerals with a few well-chosen words, and then we forget entirely that an object given with love is rarely as simple as it looks. If you are the kind of person who keeps things, who has a drawer somewhere with letters or photographs or a piece of jewelry that belonged to someone you loved, I want you to comment below and tell me what that object is. I promise you, I read every single comment, every single one, late at night with a cup of tea, and there is something about hearing from strangers all over the world who understand exactly what I mean that makes this old woman feel a little less alone with her memories. The drive home that morning was perhaps 8 minutes long, and I do not believe either of us spoke for the first 5 of them. Eleanor sat with the handkerchief in her lap, staring out at the wet hedgerows along College Street as though the answer to whatever was troubling her might be hiding somewhere in the autumn leaves. I asked her gently whether she was unwell. She told me she was simply tired. I asked whether something had happened at the bookshop where she does her restoration work. She said no, nothing of the sort. I did not press her further, because in 43 years of marriage to my own husband and 11 years of watching my son's marriage unfold, I have learned that some silences are not meant to be broken by force. They break on their own, in their own time, usually at the moment you least expect it. Ours broke in my own front hallway. We had only just stepped inside, and I was reaching to take Eleanor's coat from her shoulders the way I always did, when the handkerchief slipped from between her fingers and fell, almost soundlessly, onto the hallway floor. I bent to pick it up, my knees protesting the way they always do these days. And that is the precise moment, ladies and gentlemen, that everything I believed about my own family quietly came undone. The lace had folded over on itself as it fell, exposing the back of that small embroidered corner, the side that almost never sees the light, the side meant only for the hands of whoever happens to be holding it. And there, beneath the honeysuckle my mother had stitched more than 50 years ago, half hidden in a fold so deliberate it could not possibly have been an accident, was a second layer of thread. Finer. Older. Worked in a pale gray silk that had been chosen, I would later come to understand, specifically because it would never draw attention against the cream-colored linen. I want you to imagine, for a moment, the patience required to hide something inside a piece of embroidery so completely that even a trained conservator's eye, a woman who has spent 40 years examining old paper and older thread for a living, did not see it for more than half a century. Whoever stitched those hidden letters did not want them found easily. They wanted them found only by someone who was already kneeling down, already looking closely, already willing to turn the lace over and study its underside with the kind of attention most of us reserve for things we are afraid we are about to lose. There were initials. 3 of them, worked in a tiny, careful chain stitch no larger than a grain of rice. There was a date, the numbers so small I needed my reading glasses and a better light than the hallway offered to be certain I had read them correctly. And beneath the date, in letters even smaller still, was a phrase. 6 words. I will tell you, in good time, exactly what those 6 words said, because I think you deserve to discover them the way I did, slowly, with your heart already beating a little faster than it should. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to thank you properly, because I know this old woman takes her time getting to the heart of things, the way every good story from every good grandmother eventually does. There is a brand new story here every single day, each one rooted in something true about family, about silence, about the things we inherit without ever fully understanding them. If this one has already pulled you in the way it pulled me in that morning, in my own hallway, please subscribe so that tomorrow's story finds you too. And do tell me, down in the comments, whether you have ever discovered something hidden inside an object you thought you already knew completely. I have a feeling I am not the only person watching tonight who has lived through a moment like that one. I sat down on the bottom stair, the handkerchief in my lap, and I asked Eleanor, as calmly as I could manage, how long she had known. She told me she had only discovered it herself 3 days earlier. While pressing the lace ahead of bringing it to Mass that morning, a small ritual she performed perhaps twice a year. She said she had turned it over to check the seam, the way any careful restorer would, purely out of habit, and that she had very nearly dropped it then too. She said she had spent 3 sleepless nights trying to decide whether to tell me at all, and that the only reason she finally did was because she could not, in good conscience, sit beside me in church for one more Sunday holding a secret that belonged, in some way she could not yet explain, to my own mother's hands. I want you to understand something about Eleanor Whitby. She is not a dramatic woman. In 11 years, I have never once seen her raise her voice, never seen her cry without trying desperately to hide it first, never seen her make a decision without first turning it over in her mind, the way she turns over the spine of an old book before deciding how best to repair it. For a woman like that to come undone in a church car park over a piece of lace meant, to me, that whatever those hidden letters represented was not a small thing. It was not decoration. It was not coincidence. It was a message, deliberately concealed, deliberately preserved, and deliberately handed down through 3 generations of women who, as far as I knew, had never once spoken its meaning aloud. We sat together at my kitchen table that afternoon, the same table where I have served 4 generations of Sunday lunches, and we examined the hidden stitching under the strongest lamp I own. The initials, I came to believe, were not Eleanor's, and they were not my mother's either. The date stitched beneath them placed the embroidery work at least 15 years before my mother ever sat down with that particular piece of linen in her lap. Which meant, quite simply, that the honeysuckle I had always believed was the entire design, the gift my own mother had supposedly created from nothing, had in fact been embroidered over something that already existed. My mother had not created that handkerchief at all. She had inherited it, hidden a secret already stitched inside it, added her own honeysuckle on top to disguise what lay beneath, and then passed the whole disguised bundle on to me as though it were entirely her own work. I do not mind telling you, friends, that my hands were not entirely steady by the time I poured our tea that afternoon. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something, because I think the answer matters more than you might expect. Have you ever learned that someone you loved, someone you thought you knew completely, had been keeping a secret for decades, not out of dishonesty, but out of a kind of fierce, quiet love they did not know how else to protect? Write that down in the comments if you have. Tell me what it felt like the moment the truth finally surfaced. And if this story is already reminding you of someone in your own family, someone with secrets stitched, quite literally or otherwise, into the fabric of your own history, do me the smallest favor and share this video with them. You never know which story is going to be the one that finally gives somebody the courage to ask the question they have been too afraid to ask for years. That evening, after Eleanor had gone home and the house had settled into its usual Sunday quiet, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the handkerchief spread flat beneath the lamp, and I allowed myself, for the first time since picking it up off my hallway floor, to think properly like the conservator I had spent my whole career training myself to be, rather than like a frightened old woman clutching at her own family's ghosts. I thought of Winchester itself, this city I have called home for the whole of my adult life, a city built quite literally on layers of buried history. You cannot dig a garden bed on St. Cross Road without striking some fragment of Roman brick or medieval pottery, because this ground has been lived on, loved on, and quietly buried over for nearly 2,000 years. King Alfred the Great chose Winchester as his capital more than 11 centuries ago, and his statue still stands at the top of the high street, sword raised, looking down on shoppers and schoolchildren who rarely glance up to wonder why an Anglo-Saxon king is watching over their Tuesday afternoon. The cathedral where Eleanor had knelt that very morning holds the bones of kings far older than anyone now remembers by name, sealed inside painted wooden chests high above the choir stalls, mortuary chests that have sat undisturbed through fires, through civil war, through centuries of changing fashion in faith itself. And not half a mile from my own front door stands the Hospital of St. Cross, founded in 1132, where to this very day a visitor who knocks at the old porter's gate and asks politely may still receive the wayfarer's dole, a small piece of bread and a cup of ale, a tradition of quiet, unspoken charity that has continued almost without interruption for nearly 900 years. I tell you all of this because I think it matters. I think it matters that I live in a place where the past does not stay neatly buried, where the ground itself seems to insist on being honest with you eventually, however long it takes. Perhaps that is why, sitting at my kitchen table that night, with a magnifying lamp and an old woman's failing eyesight, I did not feel afraid so much as I felt summoned. Whoever had hidden those letters inside that lace had trusted that someday, someone patient enough, someone willing to kneel down and look properly, would finally find them. They had waited more than half a century for exactly the kind of attention I had spent my entire working life learning how to give. I decided, that very evening, that I would find out who those initials belonged to, what that date signified, and what those 6 small embroidered words were truly trying to say. I had no idea, sitting there with my reading glasses pushed up onto my forehead and a cooling cup of tea at my elbow, that the search would lead me through parish registries and forgotten estate inventories, through the careful, guarded memory of an elderly archivist who still remembered my mother's maiden name, and eventually into a conversation around this very kitchen table that would change, quietly and permanently, the way every member of my family understood who we actually were to one another. But that, dear friends, is a story for the next part of our evening together. Before we go any further, I do want to remind you, because I think it bears repeating, that a new story like this one finds its way to you every single day, each one true in its bones, even where the names and faces have been gently changed to protect the people who lived them. If you have not yet subscribed, I would be ever so grateful if you did. And if this story has moved something in you tonight, even something small, leave this old woman a like before you go. It tells me you are still here, still listening, still willing to sit with me a little longer at this kitchen table while I work my way, stitch by stitch, toward the truth. I did not sleep particularly well that first night, and I will tell you honestly, at 79 years old, sleep is precious enough that I do not give it up lightly. I lay awake, turning the date over and over in my mind, the way I once turned over the date on a water-stained letter or a half-burned ledger page, trying to place it against everything else I knew about my own family's history. The numbers stitched beneath those 3 small initials placed the work somewhere in the early 1950s, which meant, by my own calculations, that the handkerchief had already existed, already carried its hidden message, a full 15 years before my mother ever sat down by the fire with her honeysuckle thread. 15 years is not a small gap. 15 years is long enough for a secret to be passed silently from one set of hands to another, long enough for a young woman to become an old one without ever once speaking aloud whatever burden she had agreed to carry. If you are joining me again for this second part of the story, welcome back. And thank you for trusting an old woman to take you somewhere worth going. I would love to know, in the comments below, what time it is wherever you are tucked in tonight. Some of you, I know, watch these stories at the very end of a long day. Others, first thing in the morning with your coffee still steaming. I find a strange comfort in knowing that no matter the hour, somewhere in the world, someone is sitting quietly with me while I work through this. If that someone tonight happens to be you, leave me a like and tell me your city. because it genuinely does help to know I am not simply talking to an empty room. The following morning, a Monday, I telephoned an old friend and former colleague, a woman by the name of Margaret Price, who for 36 years served as the diocesan archivist at the Cathedral Library, the very institution where I myself spent the final decade of my career repairing documents far older and far more fragile than a single embroidered handkerchief. Margaret is 81 now, sharper than most women half her age, and she possesses something I have always envied in an archivist, which is a memory for names that seems entirely unaffected by the passage of time. I told her, without going into too much detail just yet, that I had come across some embroidered initials and a date from the early 1950s, and that I was hoping she might know where to begin looking. Margaret invited me to the Cathedral Library the very next afternoon, and I want to tell you because I think it matters to anyone who has never had the privilege of sitting inside a building like that one, what it feels like to walk through those doors. The Cathedral Library at Winchester is one of the oldest in England, its chained books still attached to their original medieval shelving by iron links forged centuries before either Margaret or I were born. A security measure from a time when a single book might represent the entire wealth of a parish. The air inside smells of old leather, of dust that has somehow learned to smell pleasant rather than unpleasant, of beeswax polish and slowly decaying paper held carefully at bay by careful temperature control. Margaret was waiting for me at her usual table near the south window. 3 boxes of parish records already pulled from the archive shelves and waiting, as though she had somehow known before I even arrived, that this particular search was going to matter. I showed her the initials first, sketched onto a scrap of paper rather than risking the handkerchief itself in an unfamiliar setting, because old habits, even retired ones, do not entirely disappear. Margaret studied them for a long moment through her own reading glasses, and then she said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. She told me that those 3 letters, in that particular ornamental script, with that particular flourish on the final letter, reminded her very strongly of a style of monogram favored by a specific family of Winchester linen merchants in the years immediately following the war. A family whose name, she said slowly, watching my face the entire time she spoke it, had once been closely connected to my own mother's family before either of us were born. I want to pause here, friends, because I think it is important to be honest with you about how a moment like that actually feels, sitting in a library that has stood for 800 years, listening to an old friend speak a surname you have never once heard, spoken in connection with your own mother. It does not feel like fear exactly. It feels more like the floor of a familiar room turning out to be slightly tilted, just enough that you suddenly notice you have been standing at an angle your entire life without realizing it. Before I tell you the name Margaret spoke that afternoon, I want to ask something of you. If you have ever sat in an archive, a church record office, a solicitor's waiting room, anywhere at all, and heard a single name spoken aloud that quietly rearranged everything you believed about your own family, I would love for you to share that experience in the comments below. These stories, I have come to learn, mean more to the people watching them when we are honest with one another about how strange and how disorienting the truth can sometimes feel, even when, in the end, it turns out to be a kind truth rather than a cruel one. And if you are finding value in this evening together, please do subscribe, because tomorrow brings another story, another family, another quiet truth finally working its way to the surface after far too many years buried. The name Margaret gave me that afternoon was Whitcomb, a family of linen merchants who had operated a modest but well-respected shop on the square, not far from the Cathedral Close, from the 1890s until the business finally closed its doors in the late 1960s. Margaret remembered the name distinctly because her own mother had purchased her wedding linens there in 1949, and because, she told me, there had once been a small scandal attached to the family, the precise details of which she could no longer recall with any confidence, only that it had something to do with property, with an inheritance dispute, and with a young woman who had left Winchester rather suddenly, sometime in the early 1950s, and, as far as anyone in the parish ever knew, never returned. I drove home from the cathedral library that evening with my mind working faster than it had in years, turning the pieces over the way I once turned over fragments of a torn document, trying to imagine what shape they might eventually form if I could only locate enough of them. A linen merchant family, a young woman who left town and never came back, a date stitched in secret onto a piece of fine linen, exactly the kind of fabric a merchant family would have had ready access to, and a connection, however distant, however unexplained, to my own mother's people. That night, I telephoned my son, Edmund, Eleanor's husband, a solicitor by profession, 53 years old, steady and measured in the way that good solicitors learn to be. Though I will tell you honestly that underneath all that careful professional calm, my son has always been, since the day he was born, a deeply sentimental man who simply prefers other people not to notice it. I told him what Eleanor and I had found and what Margaret had told me that afternoon, and I asked him gently whether he had ever heard the surname Whitcomb spoken anywhere in our family's history. There was a silence on the other end of the telephone long enough that I very nearly asked whether the line had dropped. When Edmund finally spoke, his voice had changed, just slightly, in a way that only a mother who has known her son for 53 years would have noticed. He told me that he had, in fact, heard that name once before, many years ago, from his own grandmother, my mother-in-law, on his father's side, during one of the rare occasions in his childhood when the old woman had spoken at length about the past, rather than briskly changing the subject the way she usually did. He could not remember the full context. He had been perhaps 9 or 10 years old at the time, more interested, he admitted, with something close to embarrassment in his voice, in finishing his pudding than in listening properly to an elderly relative's reminiscing. But he remembered the name itself, spoken with a particular weight, a particular carefulness, the kind of weight a family reserves for names it has quietly agreed not to discuss too often. I want you to understand something about families, the kind of thing I have come to understand only after 79 years of living inside one. We are forever building little unspoken agreements with one another about which names we say easily and which names we let drop, gently, into silence, without ever formally deciding to do so. Nobody calls a family meeting to announce that a particular subject is now forbidden. It simply happens, gradually, generation by generation, until eventually nobody quite remembers why a certain name makes the room go quiet, only that it does, and that some old instinct tells everyone present not to ask. If that sounds familiar to you, even slightly, even about a name or a person entirely different from anything in my own story, I would ask you to consider leaving a comment about it tonight. I have found, in the months since I began sharing these stories, that the comments beneath them have become something like a second family to me, an entire gathering of strangers who somehow, despite never having met me, understand exactly what I am describing because they have lived something remarkably similar themselves. And if you would like to keep gathering with us, story after story, please make sure you have subscribed, because there is always another evening, another kitchen table, another family quietly working its way toward the truth. The following Saturday, Eleanor and I visited the Hampshire Record Office together, the very institution where I spent the first 3 decades of my professional life, and where, mercifully, several of the staff still remembered me well enough to grant us rather more generous access to the relevant estate and parish records than a member of the public might ordinarily expect. We spent the better part of 4 hours moving through ledgers, baptismal registers, and a remarkably well-preserved set of probate inventories from the local solicitors who had handled the Whitcomb family's affairs in the years immediately following the war. What we found there, I will admit, surprised me far more than I expected it to. The young woman who had apparently left Winchester so suddenly in the early 1950s was not, as I had quietly begun to assume, an outsider to my own family at all. According to a single faded entry in a parish register, witnessed and signed by my own grandfather, she had in fact been my mother's elder sister. A woman, in other words, whose existence I had never once heard mentioned in 79 years of life, an aunt I had not known I possessed, who had apparently vanished from every family conversation, every photograph album, every casual remark about cousins or aunts or grandparents as completely and as thoroughly as if she had simply never existed at all. I sat very still at that record office table for what felt like a long while, Eleanor's hand resting quietly on my arm, while I tried to make sense of the fact that my own mother, the woman who had embroidered honeysuckle by the fire during the last winter of her life, had carried the memory of a sister, an entire sister, in complete silence for the whole of my childhood and adolescence and well into my own adulthood, and had never once allowed that name to pass her lips in my presence. I think, friends, this might be the moment in tonight's story where I ask you the harder question, the one I have been circling around without quite asking directly. Have you ever discovered later in life that someone existed in your own family who had simply been erased from every conversation, every photograph, every memory anyone was willing to share with you? Not through malice necessarily, but through some old, complicated grief that nobody ever found the words to properly explain? If the answer is yes, I want you to know that whatever you are carrying because of that discovery, you are not carrying it alone tonight. And if the answer is no, if your own family has been spared that particular kind of silence, then I am genuinely glad for you. And I hope you will stay with me anyway, because I think there is something in this story for everyone, whatever shape your own family happens to take. Before we go any further into what Eleanor and I discovered about my aunt, about the 6 embroidered words still waiting to be properly understood, and about the reason my mother chose to hide an entire stitched message inside a piece of lace rather than simply speaking the truth aloud, I want to pause for what I promise will be the last time this evening. If you have made it this far with me, through 2 long parts of a story that is only just beginning to reveal its true shape, please do me the kindness of subscribing if you have not already, and leaving this video a like so that other people searching for something true and something gentle might find their way to it as well. Tomorrow brings a new story, but tonight, this story, our story, Agnes and Eleanor and a long-forgotten aunt named Whitcomb, is not yet finished. There is so much more I need to tell you, about the 6 words hidden in that lace, about what my mother spent 50 years protecting, and about the dining table conversation that would finally, after 3 generations of careful silence, bring the whole truth out into the light. Stay with me. We are only just getting started. I want to tell you something honestly, friends, before I go any further into this story. Discovering an aunt I never knew existed did something to me that I find difficult to put into ordinary words, even now, weeks later, even with the whole matter long since resolved. It was not grief exactly, because grief requires that you have first known and loved the person you have lost. It was something closer to vertigo, the strange swaying sensation of realizing that the floor you have stood on your entire life was never quite as solid as you believed. If you are just joining us this evening, welcome, and thank you for letting an old woman bring you along on this rather peculiar journey through her own family's history. I would love to know, before we go any further, whether you have ever sat in a record office, a solicitor's office, anywhere quiet and official, and felt the ground shift beneath you the way mine did that Saturday afternoon. Tell me in the comments. And if this story has earned itself a place in your evening, give it a like, because it genuinely helps these stories find the people who need them most. Her name, according to the parish register Eleanor and I found that afternoon, was Beatrice Whitcomb, born in 1926, the elder daughter of my grandparents, Walter and Mary Whitcomb, 8 years older than my own mother, Constance. The entry recording her baptism was tidy, unremarkable, the same careful copperplate hand that recorded every christening in that parish for decades. It told me nothing beyond a name, a date, and the names of 2 godparents I had never heard of in my life. But it told me, more importantly than anything written on the page, that she had existed, that she had been a real, living, breathing girl who had once played in the same Hampshire lanes my mother played in, who had perhaps walked the same path along St. Cross Road that I myself have walked nearly every day for 43 years, and who had, at some point, vanished so completely from family memory that not even her own great-granddaughter, who is to say myself, had ever heard her name spoken aloud. Eleanor, sitting beside me at that long oak table in the record office, was quieter than I had perhaps ever seen her. I think she understood, better than I did in that first hour, what it would mean for me to carry this discovery home and somehow fold it into the family I had believed I understood completely. She is a restorer by training, after all, a woman whose entire profession is built around the careful, patient work of returning damaged things to a state where their history can be read clearly again, without destroying whatever fragile structure still holds them together. She did not rush me. She simply sat with me, turning pages when I asked her to, and let the silence between us do whatever work silence needed to do. It was Margaret Price, 3 days later, who helped me find the next piece of the puzzle. And I want to tell you about the afternoon I spent in her company at the Cathedral Library, because I think it illustrates something important about how the past actually reveals itself to those patient enough to go looking. It does not arrive all at once, the way it sometimes does in films, with a single dramatic document that explains everything in one tidy paragraph. It arrives in fragments, in odd corners of unrelated records, in the careful cross-referencing of one small fact against another, the way a conservator might piece together a torn letter from 40 scattered fragments, slowly, methodically, never entirely certain the full picture will ever emerge, and yet unable to stop looking once the first few pieces have found their place. Margaret had spent the days since my last visit doing exactly the kind of work she has done for the cathedral for nearly 4 decades, quietly tracking down records that most people would never think to ask for. She had located, through a contact at the Diocesan Registry in Portsmouth, a marriage record from the spring of 1952. Beatrice Whitcomb, spinster of this parish, aged 26, had married a man named Frederick Calloway, a schoolmaster, in a small registry office ceremony some 40 miles from Winchester, in a village near Salisbury that neither Margaret nor I had ever had particular reason to visit. There were no Whitcomb family witnesses listed on the certificate, only Frederick's own brother, and a woman who appeared, from a separate record Margaret managed to track down that same afternoon, to have been a colleague of his from the school where he taught. I sat with that marriage certificate for a long while, friends, turning it over in my hands the way I once turned over a fragile document I was preparing to repair, looking for whatever small clue might explain why a young woman would marry 40 miles from her own family, with none of her own people standing beside her on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. Before I tell you what Margaret and I eventually pieced together about why Beatrice left, and why the family never spoke her name again, I want to ask something of you, because I think it matters to the heart of this story. Have you ever wondered about a relative who simply was not there in the family photographs? Someone whose absence you only noticed years later, once you finally thought to count the empty spaces, rather than only looking at the faces that were present? If you have a story like that of your own, even a small one, even one you have never told anyone before, I would be honored if you shared it in the comments tonight. And if you have not yet subscribed to these stories, I would ask you, gently, the way I might ask a guest to stay just a little longer for one more cup of tea, to consider doing so now, because there is always another evening, another family, another quiet truth waiting its turn to be told. The answer, when it finally came, arrived not from a register or a certificate, but from an unexpected source entirely, a woman named Vera Henshaw, 93 years old, who still lives, remarkably independently, in a cottage near the Hospital of St. Cross, not a quarter mile from my own front door. Margaret remembered, during our second afternoon together at the Cathedral Library, that Vera's late husband had once worked as an apprentice at the Whitcomb family's linen shop on the square, back when he was a young man in the years immediately following the war. I telephoned Vera that same evening, somewhat nervously, explaining who I was and what I was hoping to learn, and she invited me to visit her the following morning. Before, she said, with a small dry laugh down the telephone line, her memory decided to misbehave again and forget the whole conversation. Vera Henshaw's cottage smelled of lavender polish and wood smoke, the particular comforting smell of a home that has been lived in contentedly for a very long time. She received me in a small front parlor crowded with photographs spanning what must have been 70 years of Winchester life, and she poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, but with a confidence that told me she had performed this exact small ceremony for visitors many hundreds of times before. I showed her, at her invitation, a photograph of the marriage certificate Margaret had found, and I watched her face change the moment her eyes settled on the name Beatrice Whitcomb. She remembered her, she told me. Not well, not closely, but she remembered the shape of the story, the way an entire neighborhood sometimes remembers a shape without remembering every precise detail. Beatrice, she said, had been the elder daughter of a respected local family, expected, in the particular way young women of that generation were so often expected, to marry well and marry locally, to continue the kind of quiet, comfortable life her own parents had built for themselves through 3 decades of steady linen trade on the square. But Beatrice, Vera told me, had fallen in love instead with a schoolmaster from outside the county, a man with very little money and even less in the way of family connections that mattered to people like the Whitcombs in those particular years. I want to be careful here, friends, because I know how easily a story like this one can be misunderstood if I am not precise about what actually happened and what did not. There was no scandal of the sort that ruins a young woman's reputation in old novels. There was no disgrace, no shame, nothing remotely improper in the slightest. There was simply, as Vera explained it to me that morning, an old-fashioned family disagreement about money, about expectation, about the particular kind of life a daughter was meant to want for herself, set against the particular kind of life that daughter had actually fallen in love with instead. Beatrice's parents, my own great-grandparents, disapproved strongly enough of the match that when Beatrice married Frederick Calloway anyway, in that quiet registry office 40 miles from home, the family essentially closed its door behind her and did not open it again. This is, I think, a kind of family wound that many of you watching tonight will recognize in some form, even if the precise details of your own family's version look nothing like mine. The particular grief of a parent who loves their child desperately and yet cannot, for reasons buried somewhere in their own fears and their own upbringing, find a way to accept the life that child has chosen for herself. The particular grief of a child who loves her parents and yet cannot bring herself to abandon the love she has found elsewhere, even at the cost of that family's blessing. There is no villain in a story like that one. There is only 2 kinds of love pulling in opposite directions, and an entire family left, afterward, not knowing quite how to speak about the wound that resulted. I asked Vera gently whether she knew what eventually became of Beatrice and Frederick. She told me she believed they had settled somewhere near Salisbury, that Frederick had continued teaching for many years, and that she had heard, second-hand, many years later, that Beatrice had passed away sometime in the 1980s, though Vera could not be entirely certain of the precise date. She did not believe there had ever been any reconciliation between Beatrice and her own parents, my great-grandparents, before they themselves passed away in the early 1960s. As far as Vera understood it, the breach between them had simply remained open, unhealed, for the rest of all of their lives. I drove home from Vera's cottage that morning with a heaviness in my chest that I have not entirely managed to put into words even now, telling you this story weeks after the fact. Somewhere, I realized, there might be cousins of mine, second cousins, perhaps even closer relatives still living, descendants of Beatrice and Frederick Calloway, people who shared my own blood and my own history, and yet had grown up entirely outside the boundaries of the family I had always believed myself to belong to completely. The thought of them, whoever and wherever they were, sat with me uncomfortably for the rest of that day. But it was that very evening, sitting once again at my kitchen table with the handkerchief spread beneath the lamp, that I finally understood the connection between Beatrice's story and the date stitched in secret thread beneath my mother's honeysuckle. The date Margaret and I had so carefully deciphered, that early 1950s date hidden in pale gray silk, fell almost precisely in the same season as Beatrice's quiet wedding 40 miles from home. Which meant, as far as I could now reasonably calculate, that whoever had first stitched those hidden initials into that piece of linen had done so at almost exactly the moment Beatrice left Winchester and the family closed its door behind her. I want to pause here, friends, because I think we have arrived at the heart of this evening's mystery, even if we have not yet fully solved it. If you have been with me this whole journey, through the handkerchief, through the cathedral library, through Vera's small lavender-scented parlor, I am so deeply grateful for your patience, because I know I have taken my time getting here, the way every grandmother eventually does when the story she is telling actually matters to her. There is a brand new story waiting for you here tomorrow, but tonight, this one, is not yet finished. I have not yet told you the 6 words hidden in that embroidery, and I have not yet told you what happened when Eleanor, Edmund, and I finally sat down together to decide what, if anything, we ought to do with everything we had learned. Before I continue, I would ask, sincerely, that if this story has moved you even slightly, you consider leaving it a like and subscribing for tomorrow's story, because these small gestures, more than you might realize, are what allow an old woman like myself to keep telling them. And if you have ever felt the particular grief of a family divided over love, over money, over the quiet, old-fashioned expectations one generation places on another, I would love nothing more than to read about it in the comments tonight. Tell me your story. I promise you, I am listening. What I needed to discover next, and what occupied the better part of the following week, was the precise identity behind those 3 small initials, and the exact meaning of the 6 words stitched in a hand so careful it could only have belonged to someone determined that the message survive, whatever else happened to the family that carried it forward. There is a particular kind of patience required for restoration work, the sort I practiced for the whole of my professional life, and it is not, contrary to what people often imagine, primarily a patience of the hands. It is a patience of the mind. You must be willing to sit with an incomplete picture for far longer than feels comfortable, resisting the very human temptation to fill in the missing pieces with whatever story feels most satisfying, rather than waiting, as long as it takes, for the actual evidence to reveal what truly belongs there. I had spent 4 decades training myself in exactly that discipline. And I am going to tell you honestly, friends, that the week following my visit to Vera Henshaw tested every bit of that training against the much less disciplined, much more emotional instincts of a grandmother who simply wanted to understand her own family. If you are joining me this evening for the next chapter of our story, I am so glad you are here. I would love to know, before we go any further, what season it is where you are sitting right now. Some of you, I know, are watching this in the depths of winter, others perhaps in the warmth of an entirely different hemisphere's summer. There is something rather lovely about imagining all of you, scattered across the whole of the world, gathered nonetheless around this one small story together. If that thought pleases you as much as it pleases me, leave this video a like and tell me your season down in the comments. I returned to the initials themselves with fresh eyes, sitting once again at my kitchen table with the handkerchief, my strongest lamp, and a magnifying glass that had served me faithfully through 30 years of manuscript work. The 3 letters, worked in that tiny, deliberate chain stitch, were B, M, and C. Beatrice, I now understood with reasonable confidence, accounted for the B. The C, I suspected, might stand for Calloway, the surname she had taken upon her marriage. But the middle letter, the M, puzzled me for several days, until Margaret, during our 3rd afternoon together at the cathedral library, located a baptismal record that finally resolved it. Beatrice's full given name, as recorded at her own christening in 1926, had been Beatrice Margaret Whitcomb. The initials were entirely her own, stitched, I now believed, by Beatrice herself, sometime around the moment of her marriage, before she ever left Winchester for the small registry office near Salisbury, which left only the 6 embroidered words themselves, the phrase I had promised at the very beginning of this story that I would eventually share with you. I want to take a moment before I do to thank you properly for staying with me this far. I know this story has unfolded slowly, the way these things genuinely do unfold when you are following the truth rather than inventing a tidier version of it for the sake of a quicker ending. There is a new story here every single day, but I think, of all of them, this particular one has taught this old woman more about her own family than perhaps any other discovery of her long life. If you have not yet subscribed, I would be ever so grateful if you did, so that tomorrow's story finds its way to you as well. And if you are the sort of person who likes to guess ahead of a reveal, I would genuinely love to read your guesses about those 6 words down in the comments before I tell you. Humor and old woman. It is rather fun to see what you all imagine. The 6 words, once Margaret and I had finally deciphered every tiny, careful letter under the strongest magnification either of us could arrange, read as follows. For whoever finds this, forgive her. I sat with those 4 words longer than I care to admit, friends, because they raised an entirely new question that neither the parish registers nor Vera Henshaw's memory had yet answered. Forgive her for what, precisely? Forgive her for leaving. Forgive her for marrying against her parents' wishes. Or forgive her for something else entirely. Something neither Margaret nor I had yet uncovered. Something that had perhaps mattered far more to Beatrice herself than the simple fact of an unapproved marriage. It was Eleanor, in the end, who found the answer, and I think it is rather fitting that she did, given that her own steady, careful profession is built entirely around understanding what an object is truly trying to tell you, even when its surface has been deliberately disguised. She had taken the handkerchief, with my permission, to her own workshop, the small converted outbuilding behind her and Edmund's home, where she repairs antique books for collectors and museums across the south of England, in order to examine the linen itself under equipment far more sophisticated than anything I owned at my own kitchen table. She wanted, she told me, to understand not just what the hidden stitching said, but what kind of linen it had been worked into, and whether that linen carried any further clues of its own. What she discovered, examining the weave and the particular finishing technique of the fabric beneath strong magnification, was that the linen itself had originated, almost certainly, from her own family's old shop on the square. The Whitcomb linen merchants had specialized, Margaret later confirmed through an old trade directory, in a particular fine bleached linen reserved for their most valued private customers, woven to a recipe the family had guarded for 2 full generations. Which meant, Eleanor explained to me, sitting at my kitchen table with her own magnifying lamp borrowed from the workshop, that the piece of linen Beatrice had embroidered with her hidden message was very likely a remnant taken directly from her own family's private stock, perhaps even cut from a bolt intended originally for her own wedding trousseau. The elegant household linens a young woman of that era was traditionally given by her family before her marriage. If that is true, friends, and I have come to believe, with reasonable confidence, that it is, then Beatrice did not simply leave a message somewhere convenient. She took a piece of her own family's most treasured fabric, the very fabric meant to represent the dowry and the blessing they were refusing to give her, and she transformed it in secret into something else entirely. A confession, an apology, a small, hidden plea addressed not to her parents, who she perhaps already understood would never read it, but to whoever, someday, far in the future, might be patient enough and curious enough to actually find it. I want to ask you something now, and I think it is perhaps the most important question this story has raised so far. Why would a young woman, leaving her family under such painful circumstances, embroider an apology rather than simply writing a letter she could send directly to the people she was apologizing to? Why hide the words at all rather than speaking them plainly, where everyone might actually see and understand them in her own lifetime? I have turned that question over more times than I can count, and I believe, though I cannot claim absolute certainty, that I have finally arrived at something close to an answer. Some apologies, friends, are too large, too tangled up with grief and pride and old-fashioned family expectation to be spoken plainly in the moment they are needed most. Sometimes a person who has caused pain, even pain she felt was entirely justified, even pain born of choosing genuine love over family approval, still carries a private wish to be understood eventually by someone, even if that someone does not yet exist, even if that someone will not be born for another generation or two. I believe Beatrice Whitcomb knew, somewhere in her own heart, that she would never fully reconcile with her parents in her own lifetime. And I believe she could not bear the thought that her side of the story, her own private sorrow over the breach she had caused, however justified, might simply disappear from the world entirely once she herself was gone. So she stitched it instead. Carefully, patiently, in thread so fine it would survive 50 years undisturbed, waiting, exactly as Margaret had once described, for someone willing to kneel down and look properly. I would love, friends, if you would tell me in the comments whether you believe Beatrice made the right choice, hiding her apology rather than speaking it. There is no correct answer here, only the kind of honest reflection I think this story is meant to inspire. And if this story has reached something true in you tonight, please do leave it a like and subscribe if you have not already, because there is always another true story waiting here tomorrow, and I would be genuinely glad to have you with me for it. What remained, once Eleanor and I had pieced together this much of the truth, was the much harder question of what to do with it. My own mother, Constance, had clearly known about her sister's hidden message, had clearly chosen for reasons of her own that I would need to understand more fully to embroider her own honeysuckle directly over the top of it rather than removing it, destroying it, or speaking its existence aloud to anyone, including, as far as I could tell, including me. She had then given that same disguised, double-layered handkerchief to me as though it were entirely her own simple creation. And I, in turn, completely unaware of what I was truly passing along, had given it to Eleanor on her wedding day as a symbol of family continuity and love. 3 generations of women, I realized, sitting at my kitchen table that evening, with Eleanor across from me and the lamp burning steadily between us, had each held that handkerchief in their hands without ever once speaking its true history aloud. My mother had protected her sister's secret confession by burying it beneath her own careful needlework. I had unknowingly protected it further, simply by treasuring an object I believed I fully understood. And Eleanor, finally, had been the one whose careful, patient hands, trained exactly for this kind of close attention, had finally turned that lace over and noticed what 3 generations before her had somehow managed not to see. I telephoned Edmund again that evening, and this time I asked him directly to come for dinner the following Sunday, along with his father's surviving sister, my own sister-in-law, Diana, a sharp-witted wound, 84-year-old woman who had known my mother Constance more intimately in some ways than I myself had, given that the 2 of them had been close friends for years before Diana ever married into our family. I told Edmund only that I had something important to discuss, something concerning his grandmother and a relative none of us had ever known existed. I did not yet know, hanging up that telephone, what Diana might be able to add to the story, or whether she too had spent decades carrying some small fragment of this same carefully guarded family silence. I want to close this part of our evening together, friends, with something I have been thinking about quite a lot these past few weeks. We so often imagine family secrets as things hidden out of shame, or fear, or some failure too embarrassing to admit. But I am no longer certain that is the whole truth, or even the most common truth. I am beginning to believe that more often family secrets are hidden out of love, however clumsy and however misguided that love might sometimes be. My mother did not hide her sister's confession because she was ashamed of Beatrice. I believe more and more that she hid it because she did not know how else to carry both her own grief and her sister's grief at once, and so she folded one carefully over the other, the way you might fold one quilt inside another for warmth, and she simply carried both forward, silently, for the rest of her own life, We are not yet finished with this story, friends, and I promise you, the dinner with Edmund and Diana the following Sunday revealed things I genuinely did not expect, including a discovery about my own mother's final years that I am still, even now, learning to sit with properly. There is more to tell you about Beatrice and Frederick, about the cousins I never knew I had, and about exactly what happened when that handkerchief was finally laid out, openly, on my own dining table, in front of every remaining member of this family, for the very first time in more than 70 years. But that, I think, is a story best told with a clear mind and a full night's rest behind us both. If you have stayed with me this far, through 3 generations of careful silence and 1 very patient piece of lace, thank you sincerely from the bottom of this old woman's heart. Please do leave a like if this story has earned it. Subscribe if you would like to join me again tomorrow, and tell me, down in the comments, what you believe Diana is about to reveal. I have a feeling some of you are going to guess closer to the truth than you might expect. There is a particular quality to a Sunday dinner in this family, friends, a kind of unspoken ceremony built up over 40 years of the same table, the same chairs, very often the same plates handed down from my own mother's dresser. I wanted that ordinary, comforting ritual around me on the evening I finally laid Beatrice Whitcomb's handkerchief out in the open, because I had a feeling, even before anyone arrived, that whatever truth still remained to be told would land more gently inside a room that already felt like home. If you have been with me since the very first part of this story, thank you, truly, for your patience and your company through every quiet discovery along the way. I would love to know, before we begin this final chapter together, where you have been watching from across these last few days, and whether any part of Beatrice's story has reminded you of someone in your own family. Leave that in the comments tonight, because I read every single one, and because I think this last part of the story deserves to be met with all of you gathered close, the way a family gathers close around a table when something important is finally about to be said. Edmund arrived first that Sunday evening, his coat still smelling faintly of the cold October air outside, followed shortly by Eleanor, who had spent the better part of the preceding week quietly continuing her own research into the Whitcomb linen trade in whatever spare hours her restoration work allowed her. Diana arrived last, exactly as she always does, with a bottle of sherry under one arm and the particular brisk energy of a woman who has never once in her 84 years allowed herself to be late without a perfectly good explanation prepared in advance. I laid the handkerchief in the center of my dining table, between the good china and a small dish of the same honeysuckle pattern my mother had once embroidered, and I told them, as plainly and as carefully as I could, everything Eleanor and I had discovered. The hidden initials, the marriage register from outside Salisbury, Vera Henshaw's memory of an old family rift over money and approval, the 6 embroidered words asking forgiveness from whoever might eventually find them. I watched Edmund's face carefully as I spoke, because I knew, of all of us at that table, he carried the heaviest unspoken burden of family pride. The particular solicitor's habit of believing that every situation, no matter how tangled, must surely have a tidy, defensible resolution somewhere if only one looks hard enough. It was Diana who finally broke the long silence that followed, and what she told us that evening reshaped, once again, everything I believed I had finally understood. She had known, she admitted quietly, setting down her sherry glass with great care. Not everything. Not the full history Eleanor and I had pieced together through parish records and Vera's careful memory. But she had known, for nearly 50 years, that my mother Constance carried a private grief connected to an elder sister who had left the family young and was never spoken of again. Diana had learned it, she told us, from my mother herself, late one evening many decades earlier, not long after Diana had first married into this family, during one of those rare conversations that happen only between 2 women who have decided, almost without discussing it, that they trust one another enough to finally say something true. My mother had told Diana all those years ago that her own parents, my great-grandparents, had never forgiven Beatrice for marrying against their wishes, and that they had died, both of them, within a few years of each other in the early 1960s, having never once written to her, never once visited, never once allowed her name to be spoken in their own home again. My mother, Diana said, had wanted desperately to reach out to her sister herself, to write, to visit, to mend at least one half of the broken bond, even if her parents refused to mend the other. But she had been young herself in those years, recently married, raising small children of her own, entirely dependent, both financially and emotionally, on a household that had made its feelings about Beatrice unmistakably clear. To defy her own parents on Beatrice's behalf, my mother had confided to Diana, would have meant risking the very roof over her own young family's heads, and she had simply not found in herself the courage to take that risk while her parents were still alive to disapprove of it. I want to pause here, friends, because I think this is one of the most important truths this whole story has taught me, and I would be doing you a disservice if I rushed past it too quickly. We are so often quick, looking back at the choices of an earlier generation, to judge them by the standards and the freedoms we ourselves enjoy today. It is easy sitting in my own comfortable house on St. Cross Road, financially independent, free to make my own decisions without asking anyone's permission, to wonder why my mother did not simply defy her parents and reach out to her sister regardless of the cost. But I have lived long enough now to understand that courage looks different depending on what a person actually stands to lose by exercising it, and that the women of my mother's generation, raised in a Britain still recovering from the deprivations of war, dependent in ways many of us can scarcely imagine today on the goodwill of their own families, were not cowards for staying silent. They were simply human beings, weighing an impossible choice with far fewer options available to them than the ones we so easily take for granted now. If that thought resonates with you at all tonight, I would ask you to share it in the comments, because I think there is real value in all of us, across however many countries and generations, are watching this story together, sitting with that particular kind of compassion for the people who came before us. And if you have found this story worth your evening so far, please do leave it a like, because it helps these stories travel further than this old woman could ever manage on her own. Diana told us that my mother had only acted, finally, after both of her own parents had passed away, sometime in the mid-1960s. She had written to Beatrice at last, she said, though Diana did not know precisely what that letter had contained, only that my mother had described it to her, years later, as the hardest letter she had ever written in her life. Whether Beatrice ever received that letter, whether she ever replied, whether the two sisters ever found their way back to one another even partially before Beatrice's death sometime in the 1980s, Diana simply did not know. My mother, she said, had never spoken of it again after that single late evening confession, and Diana had respected her silence enough, over the following decades, never to raise the subject a second time. It was Eleanor, examining the matter with the same careful patience she brings to every fragile, half-legible old document that passes through her workshop, who suggested the obvious next step. The one, I confess, had not yet fully occurred to me in the emotional weight of everything else we had learned. If Beatrice and Frederick Calloway had settled near Salisbury, and if Beatrice had passed away sometime in the 1980s, there was every reasonable chance that descendants of that marriage, children, grandchildren, perhaps even great-grandchildren close to my own grandchildren's ages, were still living somewhere in this country, entirely unaware that a branch of their own family tree connected back to a respected old linen merchant family in Winchester, and to a handkerchief that had spent more than 70 years carrying a secret apology, meant, in some sense, for exactly them. I want to be honest with you, friends, about how that thought sat with me that evening. Part of me, the part shaped by decades of careful, controlled professional restraint, wanted simply to close the matter there, satisfied with the truth we had already uncovered, content to let Beatrice's descendants, wherever they were, continue their own lives undisturbed by a stranger's sudden appearance with an old story about forgiveness and family rifts they had never asked to inherit. But another part of me, the part that had spent an entire career believing fiercely that broken things deserve, wherever possible, to be carefully and honestly repaired, could not quite let the matter rest there either. In the end, it was a conversation with the local parish records office, combined with some careful, patient searching by Edmund, using the kind of professional legal resources solicitors have ready access to, that finally located a living descendant. A great-granddaughter of Beatrice and Frederick Calloway, a woman named Susan Whitlock, 61 years old, living a comfortable, ordinary life in a village near Salisbury, not so very far, geographically, from where her great-grandmother had once settled after that quiet wedding so many decades earlier. I telephoned Susan myself, somewhat nervously, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and I will tell you, friends, that I have made a great many difficult telephone calls across the whole of my long life, but few of them carried quite the particular trembling weight of explaining to a complete stranger that we appeared, against every expectation either of us had carried into that conversation, to be family. Susan, it turned out, knew almost nothing about her great-grandmother's early life in Winchester. She knew only that Beatrice had married young, settled near Salisbury, raised 3 children with her schoolmaster husband, and lived by Susan's own grandmother's account, a contented if modest life until her death in 1984. She had never once heard the Whitcomb name spoken in connection with linen merchants, had no idea her own great-grandmother had once been part of a respected Winchester family, and had certainly never heard so much as a whisper about a handkerchief, hidden embroidery, or a half-century-old apology stitched in secret thread. I invited Susan to Winchester the following weekend, and I want to tell you, friends, about the particular quality of meeting a relative for the very first time at the age of 79, sitting once again at the very same dining table where so much of this story had already unfolded. Susan arrived nervous, polite, clearly uncertain what kind of family she had just been invited into, and I laid the handkerchief before her exactly as I had laid it before Edmund, Eleanor, and Diana some weeks earlier. I watched her trace the honeysuckle with one careful finger, the way you might touch something you already suspect matters more than you can quite explain. And I told her everything, from the moment it slipped from Eleanor's hands in my own front hallway through every quiet discovery that had followed. When I finally told her the 6 embroidered words, "For whoever finds this, forgive her," Susan was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I think about often now, weeks later, sitting here, telling all of you this story. She said that she had grown up all her life with a vague family impression that her great-grandmother Beatrice had been in some unspoken way a slightly sad woman, contented enough on the surface but carrying some private grief nobody in her own immediate family had ever fully understood. Susan's own grandmother, Beatrice's daughter, had apparently remarked once or twice in passing that her mother sometimes spoke of a sister back in Hampshire she had not seen in many years, always with a particular wistfulness that the family had simply absorbed, over time, as one of those small, unexplained sorrows every family seems to carry somewhere without ever quite understanding its full shape. I want to pause here, friends, because I think this is perhaps the truest, gentlest lesson this entire story has to offer, and I would ask you sincerely to sit with it alongside me for just a moment. Beatrice never knew, as far as any of us can now determine, whether her sister ever forgave her or whether her own parents' silence ever softened before they died. She carried that uncertainty, that particular ache, for the whole of her own life, far from the family she had loved and lost in equal measure. And yet, here we were, more than 70 years later, 2 branches of the same family finally sitting together at the same table, brought back into one another's lives by nothing more dramatic than a careful woman's patient hands turning over a piece of old lace. If that thought moves you at all tonight, I would ask you gently to leave a comment about it, because I think there is something genuinely important in understanding that the consequences of our smallest, quietest acts of love, even acts as small as embroidering 6 careful words into a piece of linen nobody might ever find, can ripple forward through generations in ways we ourselves will never live to witness. And if this story has earned a place in your own evening, please do leave it a like and subscribe, because there will always be another story here tomorrow, another family, another quiet truth working its slow way toward the light. In the week since that first dinner with Susan, our families have begun, carefully and without any rush, to weave themselves back together. Susan has visited Winchester twice more since that first Sunday, once with her own son, a thoughtful young man in his early 30s who works as an architect in Bristol, and who spent a full afternoon examining the old Whitcomb shop building on the square, now a small bookshop, with the particular fascination of someone discovering a piece of family history he had never known to look for. Eleanor and Susan have struck up what I suspect will become a genuine friendship, bonded over a shared interest in old documents and the careful, patient work of restoration, in every sense of that word. Diana, for her part, has taken great satisfaction in finally being able to speak my mother's old confession aloud after 50 years of carrying it silently. And I think, though she has not said so directly, that some old private weight has lifted from her shoulders in the telling. As for the handkerchief itself, friends, I made a decision I want to share with you now, because I think it carries the truest ending this story could possibly have. Eleanor, with her professional skill and her enormous patience, carefully restored the linen, stabilizing the old threads, gently cleaning more than 7 decades of careful handling, without ever once disturbing either layer of embroidery. My mother's honeysuckle resting exactly where it has always rested above Beatrice's hidden confession. We had it properly framed, under glass that protects it from light and from time alike, with both layers visible together for the very first time in living memory, the honeysuckle and the hidden words finally sharing the same light, rather than one concealing the other in darkness. It hangs now in my own front hallway, exactly where it slipped from Eleanor's hands that gray October morning, so that every single person who walks through my green front door understands, before they have even taken off their coat, that this family's history is one worth looking at closely. I think often, these days, about what I have learned from Beatrice Whitcomb, a woman I never met, who died years before I myself reached old age, and who nonetheless managed to reach across more than 70 years and teach me something I believe I will carry for whatever years remain to me. I have learned that silence, however carefully intended, however deeply rooted in genuine love and genuine fear, very rarely protects the people we hope it will protect. It simply delays the reckoning, passes the weight of an unfinished conversation down to whichever future hands happen to be patient enough or simply lucky enough to eventually pick it up. I have learned that forgiveness asked for quietly, even forgiveness nobody alive may ever read or hear, still matters, still carries weight, still reaches, eventually, exactly the person it was always meant to reach, even if that reaching takes 3 generations and a piece of old lace to finally accomplish. And I have learned, perhaps most importantly of all, that the objects we inherit from the people we love are rarely as simple as they first appear. A handkerchief is never only a handkerchief. A quilt is never only a quilt. The things our mothers and our grandmothers hand down to us, with whatever brief, careful words they manage to offer alongside them, very often carry far more history, far more love, and far more unfinished business than either the giver or the receiver fully understands in the moment of giving. I would ask every one of you watching tonight, the next time you take down some treasured object from a shelf or a drawer, an old letter, a photograph, a piece of jewelry, anything at all that came to you from someone who loved you, to look at it just a little more closely than you usually would. You may not find 6 words stitched in secret thread, but you may find something else worth understanding. Some quiet truth your own family has been gently carrying forward, without ever quite finding the courage to speak it aloud. I want to thank every single one of you, sincerely, for staying with this old woman through all 5 parts of this rather long and winding story. I know it took its time arriving at the truth, the way the truth so often does when it has been carefully hidden for more than 70 years, but I believe, with my whole heart, that it was worth every patient minute we spent together uncovering it. If you have watched this whole story through, from that gray October morning on the cathedral steps all the way to a hallway in Winchester where 2 layers of embroidery now share the same light, I would love for you to leave me a comment with a single word, forgiven, because I think only the people who truly listened the whole way through will understand exactly why that particular word matters so much to this story and to me. Please do leave this video a like if it has touched something in you tonight, and subscribe if you have not already, because there is a brand new story waiting for you here tomorrow, another family, another quiet object, another truth, patiently waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to finally find it. And if there is someone in your own life who treasures an old letter, an old photograph, an old piece of lace tucked away in a drawer somewhere, I would ask you, gently, to share this story with them tonight. You never know, friends, what quiet conversation it might finally help someone find the courage to begin. From this old woman's heart to every one of yours, scattered across however many cities and countries are listening tonight, thank you. Take good care of the people you love, and take good care, too, of the quiet objects they leave behind for you. You never know what they might still be trying to say.